We have some breaking news this morning. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has been kicked out of the Royal Lodge by his brother.
A thick, suffocating stench settled over the quiet fields before anyone even saw the trucks. As Prince Andrew prepared to move into his new home at Marsh Farm, something deeply unsettling was already unfolding behind the scenes. Locals recoiled, workers whispered, and the scale of what had been spread raised uneasy questions. Was it routine farming, a poorly timed operation, or something far more deliberate? Tension mounted, frustration grew, and Andrew's reaction was anything but quiet. What began as a simple relocation was quickly turning into something far more disturbing. The arrival marked by something unavoidable. Before a single box was carried inside, before the gates opened to receive him, something else had already announced his arrival, and it wasn't subtle. It settled into the air quietly at first, then thickened into something far harder to ignore. Residents near Marsh Farm did not need confirmation that someone new was moving in. The smell reached them long before any official sign did. It clung to the surroundings, drifting across nearby roads and fields, sharp enough to stop conversations mid-sentence and force windows shut. What made it more striking was not just its presence, but its intensity. Over the course of several days, activity behind the farmhouse had been building in plain sight. Large tankers moved in and out of the area with steady rhythm, accompanied by tractors working across the land. By the time the pattern became clear, the scale of what had taken place was already difficult to overlook. Reports would later estimate that around 150,000 gallons of liquid manure had been spread across the fields directly behind the property Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was about to occupy. This was not a minor agricultural routine carried out quietly in the background. It unfolded openly, repeatedly, and at a scale that drew attention even from those familiar with farming operations. The timing only deepened the reaction. The spreading had occurred just days before Andrew's relocation to the Sandringham estate, as preparations for his move were nearing completion. For many observing from nearby areas, the overlap felt too precise to dismiss easily. There was no attempt to conceal what was happening. The fields remained fully exposed, the vehicles visible, the work ongoing throughout the day. The smell followed, settling into the environment as a constant presence rather than a passing inconvenience. It became the first defining feature of the property, shaping the way the move was perceived even before Andrew himself stepped inside. Among locals, reactions varied but shared a common tone of disbelief. Some described it as overwhelming, others as unavoidable, and a few simply chose to keep their distance as much as possible. Conversations began to shift away from the relocation itself and toward what surrounded it. The focus was no longer on the move, the property, or even the logistics involved. It had narrowed to a single detail that refused to fade into the background. Because this was not quiet, and it was not ordinary in the way it appeared to unfold. The scale, the timing, and the visibility combined into something that felt deliberate, or at the very least, impossible to ignore. What should have been a routine transition into a new home had already taken on a different tone entirely, defined not by anticipation or adjustment, but by a lingering presence in the air that no one could escape. This was never subtle, never routine. The scale, timing, and visibility suggested something intentional, impossible to dismiss. A simple move had shifted into something heavier, charged with an unseen presence. Was this coincidence, or the beginning of something no one could avoid? Let's find out. A setting that cannot be ignored. What began as an overwhelming presence in the air did not fade with time. Instead, it revealed something far more constant, something built into the very surroundings of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's new home. The farmhouse at Marsh Farm was not tucked away from activity or shielded from the realities of the land around it. It sat directly within it, fully exposed to the daily rhythm of a working estate where movement, machinery, and fertilization were part of the environment itself. From early morning into the later hours of the day, the fields behind the property remained active. Large tankers continued their routes, arriving and departing with steady regularity, while tractors moved across the land in wide, deliberate patterns. The process was not a single event, but a repeated operation, carried out in cycles that made its presence impossible to ignore. Each pass added to what had already been spread, reinforcing the sense that this was not a temporary condition, but an ongoing reality. There was no barrier between the house and the activity, no distance to soften its impact. The fields stretched openly behind the property, leaving everything visible, exposed, and undeniably close. The same air that carried the scent moved freely through the surrounding space, settling into the environment as part of everyday life. It did not arrive and disappeared. It remained, lingering with a persistence that shaped the atmosphere around the home. This setting stood in sharp contrast to the world Andrew had left behind. At Royal Lodge, space had provided separation. The grounds were expansive, controlled, and carefully maintained to preserve privacy and distance from anything disruptive. The environment had been designed to protect, to isolate, and to maintain a certain standard of living that aligned with his position. That level of separation no longer existed. At Marsh Farm, the structure of the environment itself had changed. It was not designed to shield, but to function. The land was active, productive, and openly managed. What happened on it could not be hidden, and for anyone living within it, there was no way to step outside of that reality. The movement of vehicles, the visible spread of fertilizer, and the constant presence of agricultural work formed a backdrop that could not be switched off or avoided. For those observing from nearby areas, this contrast was difficult to overlook. The image of a former senior royal now positioned at the center of such an environment carried a weight that extended beyond simple relocation. It was not just about adapting to a smaller home or a quieter setting. It was about existing within conditions that were visibly different, publicly noticeable, and, for many, deeply symbolic. Because this was not an inconvenience that could be managed or adjusted to over time. It was a condition built into the location itself, one that surrounded the property completely and operated without pause. And within that environment, there was no clear way to step away from it, no boundary that could restore the distance that once defined his world. What once seemed manageable revealed itself as an inescapable reality, embedded in every corner of his surroundings, leaving no distance to retreat. Could this perfectly timed routine be coincidence, or evidence of something deliberately closing in around him without warning? Let's unravel the mystery. A routine that feels too perfectly timed. As the activity around Marsh Farm continued to shape the atmosphere of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's new surroundings, attention began to shift toward understanding what exactly was taking place. On the surface, the explanation appeared straightforward. The Sandringham estate had been operating under a fully organic farming system since 2018, following changes introduced under the King's management. Within that system, the use of natural fertilizer was not only expected, but essential. The estate maintained a herd of around 500 cattle, and the manure produced was processed through anaerobic digestion before being returned to the land. It contained key nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, all necessary for maintaining soil health. By those standards, the spreading of manure across farmland was entirely routine. It was part of a broader agricultural cycle designed to sustain productivity without synthetic inputs. For those familiar with organic farming, the process itself would not have raised concern. It was the scale and timing that began to draw closer scrutiny. Estimates place the volume at around 150,000 gallons, delivered and spread over multiple days in the fields directly behind the farmhouse Andrew was preparing to move into. Even within a large estate, that amount stood out. It was not a small localized application, but a wide and concentrated operation that unfolded just as preparations for his relocation were reaching their final stages. The overlap between the two events was difficult to ignore. Further context added another layer to the situation. Earlier in January of the same year, planning permission had been granted for the construction of a large slurry lagoon on the estate. The proposed structure was significant in size, reportedly equivalent to 3 Olympic swimming pools, and located less than a mile from Anmer Hall, the residence of the Prince and Princess of Wales. The lagoon was intended to support the estate's long-term organic strategy by storing and managing manure more efficiently. Taken together, these details pointed to a system that had been developing over time, The infrastructure, the livestock, and the farming methods were already in place well before Andrew's move was finalized. The activity around Marsh Farm was not created specifically for his arrival. It was part of a larger operational shift that had been unfolding across the estate for several years. And yet, the precise moment at which this large-scale fertilization occurred continued to raise questions. The fields directly behind his new home had been treated just days before he was due to settle in. The visibility of the operation, combined with its intensity and proximity, created an impression that extended beyond routine explanation. It did not appear hidden or incidental. It appeared immediate, noticeable, and closely aligned with the timing of his relocation. For observers, the distinction between standard agricultural practice and carefully timed circumstances became increasingly difficult to separate. The system itself may have been long established, but the moment at which its effects became most visible carried a weight that felt far more deliberate than accidental. Pressure mounted as routine agriculture blurred with strangely precise timing, making coincidence harder to accept. Was this simply the land following its natural cycle? Or did the moment reveal an unseen force quietly reshaping everything he thought he understood about his world? Keep watching. A shift that redefined his world. As questions around timing and visibility continued to build, the focus began to move beyond the land itself and toward what this relocation truly meant for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The environment surrounding Marsh Farm was only part of the story. The deeper change lay in the contrast between where he had been and where he now found himself, a contrast that became more striking with every detail that surfaced. For years, Royal Lodge had defined his living conditions. It was a 30-room residence set within expansive grounds, carefully maintained to ensure privacy, control, and distance from the outside world. The scale alone created separation. There was space to move, to store, to exist without interruption. Every element of the property reinforced a sense of stability and order. Daily life operated within a system that had been refined over time, offering comfort, predictability, and a clear boundary between personal space and everything beyond it. Marsh Farm presented a very different reality. The farmhouse, with its 5 bedrooms, stood modestly within an active working estate. The reduction in size was immediate and unmistakable. Rooms that once accommodated collections, staff, and personal routines were no longer available in the same way. The shift was not gradual or eased over time. It was direct, visible, and impossible to overlook from the moment the move began, forcing a rapid adjustment to a far more limited space. But the difference extended far beyond the number of rooms. At Royal Lodge, the surroundings had been designed to protect. Landscaped grounds and controlled access points created a clear boundary between private life and external activity. The environment worked to preserve distance, allowing life inside to remain largely unaffected by what happened beyond the gates. At Marsh Farm, that boundary no longer existed in the same form. The house was positioned within land that functioned continuously, where agricultural work took place in full view and at close range. The same fields that had recently been treated with large volumes of organic fertilizer remained part of the daily landscape. Movement across the land did not stop with the completion of that process. Vehicles, equipment, and routine farming activity continued to define the space around the property. The sounds, the motion, and even the lingering effects in the air became part of the everyday experience. It was an environment that operated independently of personal comfort, shaped instead by the needs of the estate and the rhythm of its operations. This shift carried a symbolic weight that was difficult to ignore. The move was not simply about changing addresses or adjusting to a smaller home. It reflected a broader transition in status, one that could be observed not through official statements, but through the nature of the surroundings. The distance, privacy, and control that once defined his living conditions had been replaced by visibility, proximity, and constant activity that could not be paused or redirected. For those watching closely, the contrast between the two properties told its own story. A former senior royal who had once lived within a space designed for separation was now situated at the center of a working landscape that offered none of those protections. The setting did not adapt to him. Instead, he was required to adapt to it, surrounded by conditions that remained active, open, and impossible to shut out, creating a reality that felt less like a transition and more like a complete redefinition of the life he had known. For those paying attention, the contrast between past privilege and present reality spoke volumes. Once shielded within controlled boundaries, he now exists exposed to an unfiltered environment. Did this quiet shift reveal adaptation or signal a deeper, irreversible loss unfolding in plain sight? Stay with us. The small details that reveal a bigger, that loss. As the reality of the move settled in, it became clear that the change was not defined solely by the size of the house or the farmland that surrounded it. The deeper impact revealed itself through smaller, quieter details, the kind that might easily be overlooked at first glance but carried lasting meaning. Each adjustment, no matter how minor it seemed, pointed to something more significant. Together, they reflected a gradual loss of familiarity, structure, and control over a life that had once followed a very different rhythm. The relocation itself had been entrusted to Gander and White, a company widely known for handling valuable and delicate items, particularly fine art. Their involvement immediately signaled the importance of what was being moved. Yet, just as noticeable was what could not be moved. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's collection of artwork, much of which had been displayed at Royal Lodge, could not simply be transferred in full. Instead, it was being moved, in stages, with clear limits imposed by the size and layout of Marsh Farm. The farmhouse could not accommodate everything, and that reality forced decisions that went beyond practical concerns and into deeply personal territory. Among the most revealing details was his well-known collection of teddy bears, a set that reportedly numbered around 72. At Royal Lodge, they had been arranged with careful attention, forming part of a daily routine that had become widely recognized. Their placement, their order, and their presence all contributed to a sense of continuity. At Marsh Farm, that number was reduced to just 1. The change might appear small on the surface, but it captured the essence of what downsizing truly meant. It was not simply about reducing belongings. It was about letting go of a pattern of living that had been maintained over many years. The shift extended beyond possessions and into the structure of daily life. At Royal Lodge, a full household staff had ensured that everything operated smoothly, from routine tasks to more complex arrangements. That level of support had been constant and reliable. At Marsh Farm, it no longer existed in the same form. Reports suggested that assistance would now be limited and available only on certain occasions. Even this reduced level of support had reportedly caused frustration, highlighting the difficulty of adapting to a system that no longer provided the same level of ease or predictability. These changes did not happen separately. They overlapped, reinforcing one another and creating a growing sense of restriction. Choices that once seemed automatic now required adjustment. Items that once defined personal space were reduced, relocated, or removed entirely. Support systems that had once operated without interruption became uncertain and limited. The result was an environment that felt increasingly unfamiliar, shaped by constraints rather than comfort. What emerged from this process was not simply a smaller home, but an entirely different way of living. The loss was not only physical, measured in space or possessions. It was structural, affecting how each day was organized and experienced. As these details accumulated, they revealed a deeper transformation, one that extended beyond relocation and began to reshape a sense of identity that had long been tied to a very different world. What surfaced was more than downsizing. It was a complete redefinition of daily life, where structure, comfort, and identity quietly unraveled. Has this new environment stripped away more than space, revealing a reality he can no longer recognize or escape? A surrounding that no longer welcomes him, as the internal adjustments within Marsh Farm continued to reshape Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's daily life. The world beyond the property line began to reveal an equally important shift. The change was not limited to space, possessions, or routine. It extended outward, into the surrounding community, where reactions to his arrival carried a tone that was noticeably restrained, and in some cases, openly distant. What might have once drawn curiosity or quiet interest instead produced a more cautious response, shaped by awareness of the circumstances surrounding him. In nearby areas such as King's Lynn, conversations about his relocation had already begun to circulate. Unlike the quiet anticipation that might typically accompany the arrival of a well-known figure, the response here was more measured and, at times, deliberately detached. Some residents expressed a clear preference to keep their distance from the situation altogether, choosing not to engage or become involved in any way. Others spoke more directly, raising questions about accountability and the circumstances that had led to his move. Their words reflected a deeper unease, suggesting that this was not simply about a change of address, but about something far more complex that had yet to be fully resolved. The tone was not one of welcome or curiosity. It was cautious, reflective, and for many, unresolved. Conversations did not carry excitement, but instead a quiet tension, as if the presence of Andrew in the area introduced a reality that people preferred to observe from afar rather than embrace. Even casual discussions seemed to circle around the same themes, returning again and again to the question of how and why he had arrived there. This reaction formed a stark contrast to the environment Andrew had previously inhabited. At Royal Lodge, the surrounding space had not only been physically controlled but socially structured in a way that reinforced his position. Interactions were managed, access was limited, and the wider public presence remained largely at a distance. There had been a clear separation between his private life and the outside world, one that ensured a degree of stability and predictability. That sense of insulation no longer existed in the same way. At Marsh Farm, the boundaries between private life and public perception felt far less defined. The surrounding community was closer, more visible, and less filtered. Reactions could not be managed in the same controlled manner, and opinions formed independently, without the structure that had once shaped how he was seen. What added further weight to the situation was his continued silence. Since returning to Wood Farm after being arrested and questioned by police the previous month, Andrew had made no public appearance and issued no statement addressing his relocation or the events surrounding it. The absence of response did not reduce attention. Instead, it intensified it. Without clarification or acknowledgement, speculation continued to build, filling the space where direct communication might have provided context. This silence created a tension that extended beyond the immediate environment of the farmhouse. It shaped how the move was interpreted, turning it from a private transition into a subject of ongoing public observation. Every visible detail, from the ongoing agricultural activity to the changes within the property, became part of a larger narrative that unfolded without direct input from the individual at its center. Within this setting, isolation began to take on a more defined meaning. It was not only the physical distance from previous surroundings, but also a shift in how he was positioned within the broader environment. The combination of limited interaction, restrained local response, and continued silence created a space that felt increasingly separate from the world he once navigated with familiarity. The result was an environment that no longer adapted around him, but instead existed independently, shaped by its own rhythms and perspectives. And within that environment, the distance between past and present became more visible with each passing day, revealing a transition that could no longer be softened or ignored. Tension crystallized into an environment no longer shaped by him, but moving on its own terms, widening the gap between past and present. Could this silent shift signal a deeper resistance forming behind palace gates, quietly redefining power itself? Stay tuned. Behind the gates, a growing resistance. As the distance between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the world around him became more defined, attention began to turn inward, toward how he was responding to the reality now taking shape behind the boundaries of Marsh Farm. The changes had been visible from the outside for weeks, but reports from within suggested that the adjustment was far from smooth. From the beginning, there had been clear signs of reluctance. The move to Marsh Farm was not widely seen as a choice he embraced. Sources indicated that he had struggled with the idea of leaving Royal Lodge, a residence that had defined his living conditions for years. The contrast between the two properties was not just physical. It represented a shift in status, routine, and expectation. Accepting that shift appeared to be one of the most difficult aspects of the transition. That difficulty began to surface in the form of frustration. The limitations of the new environment, from reduced space to restricted support, had already created pressure. Now, combined with the surrounding conditions and public attention, that pressure seemed to intensify. Reports described a growing sense of resistance, not expressed publicly, but evident in the challenges of adapting to a setting that no longer aligned with the life he had known. At the same time, structural changes to the property reinforced a sense of separation. Large wooden security gates had been installed at the entrance to Marsh Farm, a feature that had not previously existed. Their presence was noticeable, both for their size and for what they represented. They marked a clear boundary between the private space inside and the world outside, creating a controlled point of access that echoed elements of his former environment. Yet the effect was not the same. At Royal Lodge, such boundaries had been part of a larger system designed to maintain privacy while preserving a sense of status and continuity. At Marsh Farm, the gates stood within a very different context. Beyond them lay an environment that remained active, visible, and unchanged by their presence. The surrounding farmland, the ongoing agricultural work, and the reactions from the local community continued independently, unaffected by any attempt to create distance. This contrast added another layer to the situation. The gates could limit access, but they could not alter the conditions outside or the perception of what the move represented. They provided separation, but not insulation. Within that space, the effort to maintain control appeared to exist alongside the growing recognition that the environment itself could not be reshaped to fit previous expectations. Descriptions of Andrew as entitled began to circulate more frequently in discussions surrounding the move. For some observers, this characterization helped explain the reported frustration. A life defined by access, space, and support had been replaced by one that required adjustment and acceptance of limits. The transition from one to the other was not simply logistical. It was deeply personal, touching on identity, привычки, and long-established patterns of living. Inside Marsh Farm, the reality of that transition continued to unfold. The gates stood closed, the surroundings remained unchanged, and the effort to reconcile past and present carried on behind a boundary that, while visible, could not fully contain the weight of what had shifted. So, what do you think? Was this just routine farming, or a silent signal redefining Andrew's fall, his isolation, and everything surrounding him now? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.